Right. Right. So, hello everyone. Welcome. And I'm so very glad you've joined the Friends of San Pedro Valley Parks lecture series. I'm Mila Stroganoff, Programs Director and Field Trips Director for the Friends and your host tonight. Can you believe all the rain we've been having and just how cold it is out there tonight? So hope you've joined us with either a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, or perhaps some after dinner brandy. J.R. Blair has kindly agreed to join us for a talk on pollination. It will be spring soon after all, and all the insects, birds, many birds and butterflies and bats are going to do just that, pollinate flowers. And then what happens? So stay with us. Moving on, tonight's lecture, at the end of it, we will have a Q&A session and we'll take some questions and read some comments. And yes, I'm very pleased to note that the lecture will be recorded and on our website in a couple of weeks. Questions, if you will, please place them in the Q&A section, and chat is just for exactly that, chatting, comments, whatever. But the questions in Q&A, it's easier for me to handle things that way. Thank you. Our website, if you wish to see the recording or listen to it or tell your friends about it, our website is friendsofsanpedrovalleypark.org. And while I have your attention, consider becoming a member and supporting the programming. A heads up for all of you who are with us right now. On Saturday, March 23rd at 7 p.m., Dr. Carlos Davidson, Emeritus Professor of Environmental Studies from San Francisco State University, will be joining us for a lecture on amphibians, near and wide. He will be joining us for the first time. Remember to make a note on your calendars. Dr. Davidson is a wonderful speaker, and we have a fascinating lecture with excellent photos in store for everyone. And now I'll move on to our speaker this evening. J.R. Blair is well known to us and has a devoted following for a great many reasons. He has received his bachelor's degree at Evergreen State College in Olympia in Washington State and obtained his master's degree at San Francisco State University in 1999, studying with the accomplished mycologist, Dr. Denis Desjardins. He has served a 2-year term as president of the Mycological Society of San Francisco. He was Fungus Fair chairperson for 5 years. He was a lecturer of biology at San Francisco State University for 21 years and director of the university's Sierra Nevada field campus for 11 years until his retirement in December 2020. He continues to teach at the field campus every summer, and he leads great nature walks in San Pedro Valley Park for the Friends. He's also an excellent birder. So, J.R. Blair, take it away.
Thank you, Mila.
You're quite welcome.
All right, so welcome everybody. I'm really glad that you were able to join us this evening. Basically, we're going to do a primer on the biology of flowers, essentially. But we're going to start off talking about, if I can get this going here, hang on, there you go. Talking about the different kinds of plants that are out there, and just to compare a little bit to begin with, the focus of our talk today, which will be flowering plants. There are essentially 4 different categories of plants out there right now. I'll talk about a 5th one here in just a minute, but they include bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. And what I really want you to kind of focus on here is to look at the numbers of species that there are out there. So there's somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 bryophytes, about 12,000 pteridophytes, which include various things like ferns and horsetails and club mosses. and about 1,000 gymnosperms. And if you add all those up, you can see that it's about 30,000 plant species. But if you look at the angiosperms down there, you can see that there's estimated more than 260,000 plant species. And that number is going up for various reasons. One is new discoveries, another is taxonomic splitting that's happening, where we have one species that with two different subspecies or forms that we think are actually two different species. But in any case, flowering seed plants, angiosperms, are a huge group. And they mostly diversified. There was an explosion of diversification after the demise of the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. All right, let's start off talking about the plant life cycle in general. This is really different than what you might be used to as an animal. As animals, we have only one kind of cell that is haploid, haploid being the term we use to talk about a single set of chromosomes. And those are our gametes, okay, sperm cells or egg cells. And then all of the rest of our cells are diploid. That really differs from plants and other organisms. Oh, that reminds me, I forgot to mention, let me go back real quick here. There is a trend right now to include green algae as a fifth type of plant. And that's likely to be sort of ratified and accepted in general down the road. So I'm going to have to change my slideshow at that point, but not quite yet. Anyway, green algae and plants in general and a bunch of other things undergo a type of life cycle called alternation of generations. And this is where both the haploid and the diploid part of the life cycle have multicellular components. If you look at this diagram here, we're going to use throughout this talk, I'm going to use the same color coding. The bluish color there represents haploid. And again, to reiterate, that's a single set of chromosomes in all of the cells. And then the yellow is diploid, where there are two sets of chromosomes in each of the cells. And you can see that there are structures referred to as a gametophyte and sporophyte that are literally full-grown plants in this life cycle. The sporophyte being diploid, the gametophyte being haploid. Also, I want to point out something that's not labeled on this diagram, and that is that the transition from haploid to diploid is fertilization. So it's essentially the fusion of a sperm cell and an egg cell to form a zygote, which is diploid. And the transition between diploid and haploid is meiosis. And meiosis is, they call it a division reduction process. And that's where the spore mother cell, which is diploid, undergoes a division event, usually but not always twice, to form 4 haploid or reduced cells that we call spores. Now, it turns out that all plants have spores as a result of that process of meiosis. In some cases, they're pretty reduced, but there's not much going on there. But in some plants, such as the bryophytes and the pteridophytes, the spores are the propagules. Those are the part of the plant, the part of the adult plant, if you will, that basically spreads and goes out into the environment. Whereas with angiosperms and gymnosperms, those are seed plants, and that's where the seeds are the propagules. Sometimes the whole fruit is a propagule. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. There are two illustrations here, and again, remember the color coding, that the yellow is diploid and the blue is haploid, showing the bryophyte, a bryophyte at the top, so essentially a moss. And if you look at that illustration here, I'm going to use my cursor to show you. All those little yellow jobs there are what are called capsules. And here's one in a cartoon form. Those are essentially the sporophytes. And they contain, meiosis happens inside of these capsules, and they produce the spores. And then those capsules break open and release the spores. And as you can see here, it germinates into a plant, which is haploid in this case, and that's the gametophyte. The ferns and their allies, so horsetails and club mosses and other things, are a little bit different. In this case, the spores are produced in a structure called a sporangium, which is located on the diploid part of the plant, the sporophyte, essentially. And those sporangia break open, and meiosis had already occurred once that process happens, and the spores are then released. Again, spores being the propagules of these plants. There are two types of seed plants. I already mentioned them, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Gymnosperm literally means naked seed. If you think of some other terms that have that same root, gymnasium, which is an ancient Greek word for a place to get naked. And so back in the day, the Greeks would take off all their clothes and wrestle in these buildings called gymnasia. And we kept that a little bit differently now. We do keep our clothes on, but nevertheless, that's where the same root. And it turns out the gymnosperms, the reason they're called that, the naked part, is that they don't have fruits. Some of them have things that are like fruits. So, for example, many of you are familiar with female ginkgos producing these structures that kind of messy, they're fleshy and in nature, and they contain a seed, but it turns out that technically they're not fruits. Same thing with junipers. Juniper berries are not really fruits. If you're familiar with yew and nutmegs, those are also don't have fruits. And I have some other examples of some of the gymnosperms beside the ginkgo. Here's a conifer. Down here's a cycad. This is a female cycad. The cycads and the welwitschia and the ginkgo are all what we refer to as dioecious. Dioecious meaning two houses. So what that means is that the males are on one plant, the females are on another plant, and they're not on the same plant. The converse of that is monoecious, which we see in most conifers. So a pine tree, for example, will have both male cones and female cones on the same plant, one house, in other words. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here. Angiosperms, which literally means vessel seed, and again, that root angio, if you think of angiogram or angioplasty, referring to blood vessels, essentially. So this means vessel seed, and the vessel being the fruit. And technically, a fruit is a ripened ovary that generally contains seeds. Now, some angiosperms have unisexual flowers. What that means is that that the flower is either male or female, one sex in the flower. And those can be either monoecious or dioecious. So they're both monoecious and dioecious angiosperms. But a lot of the angiosperms are bisexual, which means that both the male part of the flower and the female part of the flower are on the same structure. Most of you are familiar with that, seeing that in nature. that a lot of the flowers have both anthers, which contain the pollen, the male part, and have a pistil, which is the female part. And there's some examples of some angiosperms there. All right, so I want to focus really on pollination, because that is such a major part of the life cycle of angiosperms. So this is the method by which sperm cells are transferred from either a male cone slash flower or a male part of a flower to a female cone, flower, or part of a flower. Okay. Technically, a pollen grain is actually the entire male gametophyte. So in the case of angiosperms, both the male and the female gametophytes are, even though they're still multicellular, they're highly reduced. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Also, remember that that the gametophyte is, if you were to go back in my slideshow and look at where the gametophyte is on the life cycle, it's in the haploid part of the life cycle. So pollen, being a male gametophyte, is haploid and contains 2 sperm cells. Both the angiosperms and gymnosperms, there are 2 sperm cells in each pollen grain. But this photograph, by the way, is colorized. The pollen grains under a microscope are generally clear or maybe an amber color. They're not pink, orange, or yellow. That's just a post photograph artifact. All right, so let's talk about pollen development real quickly. Gosh, I totally forgot. If you see something in bold, that's going to be on the exam. So make sure that you take note of that. And if we need a review, we can do that next Friday during my office hours. Okay, so the production of pollen. And again, I want to remind you that pollen grain is a male gametophyte. And is in the haploid section, which is the blue on this blue arrows on this screen. So after meiosis happens, 4 spores are generated from each spore mother cell. And by the way, you see the word microspores here. That not only means size, it has to do with size, but it also corresponds to the sex of the spores. So microspores are male by definition. And later on, we'll look at megaspores. Those are female by definition. So anyway, the spores are produced, and each spore then, each spore, and you can see 4 of them right here, each one will undergo mitosis, which is the process of cell division, to produce the pollen grain, also called a microgametophyte. And if you put all those things together, that's a male gametophyte. And in the pollen grain, you will see some cells, including, again, 2 sperm cells. And we can kind of jump ahead to this photograph, or this image here on the cartoon. And you can see there's 2 sperm cells in that fuchsia color, and then 1 cell that's referred to as a tube nucleus or tube cell. It turns out that the sperm cells are inside of the tube cell. And that's it. That's the full complement of cells in a male gametophyte of an angiosperm. So highly reduced. So going from basically being its own plant in some of the other things like mosses and ferns and such, to being highly reduced and very small and almost nothing. It's essentially two sperm cells with the aid of a tube cell, which we'll talk about its function in a moment here. Turns out that gymnosperms also have two sperm cells in a tube cell, but they have many, many more. I shouldn't say many, many more. They have a few dozen more cells than an angiosperm does. All right, let's talk about the female gametophyte. Now remember, the male gametophyte in angiosperms is a pollen grain. The female gametophyte in angiosperms stays on the sporophyte. So in other words, it stays on the part of the plant that is diploid. And in this illustration here, the megaspore, the haploid part of the life cycle, is located inside of the ovule. The ovule, by the way, will become a seed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. As the megaspore mother cell undergoes meiosis, again, 4 spores are produced. And in this case, which is analogous to what happens in humans, that there are 4 spores produced. Of those 4 spores, only one of those spores actually becomes a female gametophyte. The other 3 spores degenerate. And that actually happens with ova in humans. So there's only one ovum as a result of meiosis that remains viable. Again, the female gametophyte in both angiosperms and gymnosperms and seed plants in general are highly reduced. And we can see that if you look at, let me get my cursor. If you look at this illustration right here, you can see that there's 8 nuclei, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in 7 cells. And that's because one of the cells has 2 nuclei. And you can see that here again, the polar nuclei are the 2 nuclei within a cell by themselves. One of those cells is an egg cell. Now, and again, this is very small. It happens in at a microscopic level, essentially. And this, I want to reiterate that this all occurs in the pistil of the female, the female part of a flower, in the pistil. All right, so let's talk about how the sperm cells now get to the female. So if you think about pollen and that the fact that there are literally thousands of species of plants all around us at any given time, and certainly in temperate regions, even more so in tropical regions, that the diversity goes way up. But there's a lot of pollen out there. There's pollen in the air, there's pollen stuck to the legs of bees, there's pollen on people's pant legs, from walking through a field or whatever. There's a lot of pollen out there, and it's all different kinds of pollen. So these pollen grains, they are deposited on the stigma. The stigma is the very, very top of the pistil. Sometimes it has interesting shapes. Some of you are familiar with evening primrose, for example, which has a cross-shaped stigma. And another member of that family, some of the sun cups, they have looks like a little stick shift with a ball on the top of a stalk. But in any case, the very top of a pistil is called the stigma. And in that stigma, there are chemicals that can actually recognize self, recognize its own species. So that's really important because, again, there's going to be pollen landing on that stigma that's not a part of that, the same species. So when those chemicals are released by the female, the male then, the pollen grain, then undergoes a really interesting process called a tube formation, a pollen tube formation. And if you look on this illustration right here, you can see here's the pollen grains have landed on the stigma. There's two of them that have created this pollen tubes. One of them is not doing very well. It's not moving very fast. This one moved quite quickly. And that tube literally goes all the way from the tip of the stigma. And again, we're talking about a single cell here, all the way to the egg in the ovule. Now, this is quite remarkable because in some cases that single cell can be literally feet long. So think, for example, of corn. When you open up a corn ear and you take that outside part off and you throw that away, and then you've got all that stringy stuff, the silk, right? All of those are styles. A style being the tube that connects the stigma at the top of at the very distal end of the pistil to the kernel of corn, which contains the egg. Okay, so that's quite remarkable if you think about that. Again, there's two sperm cells in there. Now, these sperm cells, they travel through the tube to the female gametophyte, which is tucked inside the ovule, the future seed, and fusion happens at that point. So, and that's fertilization. So that creates a zygote, a diploid zygote, that will then become an embryo, and which will be inside of the seed, which is now still an ovule at this point. Now, the other sperm cell will travel to the center of the ovule, where it will fuse with what we call the polar nuclei, and it'll form a tissue called endosperm. And if you're following along, and this will not be on the exam because I don't have it labeled as, I don't have it in bold. The endosperm is actually triploid. So it has 3 sets of chromosomes in the endosperm. Typically, although not always, the endosperm serves as a nutrition source for the developing embryo. Again, the embryo is the result of the growth of the zygote that's been fertilized by the first sperm cell that reached the ovule. All right. Turns out that in gymnosperms, they also do much of the same kind of thing. They have a tube, and that tube contains a tube cell nucleus and 2 sperm cells. But it turns out that in gymnosperms, the first sperm cell fertilizes the egg. The second sperm cell is basically a loser. Sorry about the offending the second sperm cell, but that's what it is. All right, let's talk about pollination now. So pollen can be distributed from the male part of one plant to the female part of another plant, or in some cases to the female part on the same plant, in a couple of different ways. One is abiotic, which means that there's no living things that are involved with that. So in this case, wind. And the other, of course, will be biotic, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There are a lot of, all gymnosperms. So we're talking about conifers and the ginkgos and cycads and so on, are pollen pollinated via the wind. So the pollen is wind dispersed. So the wind blows the cones, and the pollen goes, and some of it anyway is going to find the right place so that it can create the pollen tube and get to the egg. A lot of it, of course, as you know, especially Monterey pine pollen, will end up on your car, but a lot of it will find its way to the right place as well. There are also a lot of, oh, and by the way, this micrograph here, this is a microscopic photograph, is showing pine pollen. And pine pollen is really interesting. The dark blue part here is the pollen grain proper. And then these little mouse ears that are sticking out of, Mickey Mouse ears that are sticking out of the pollen grain, those are actually air bladders. So they're super lightweight, and they give the pollen a little bit more buoyancy, so the wind will take it farther than it otherwise would. There are also some angiosperms that are wind pollinated. This is a grass, and these sort of tan things that are sticking out are the anthers that contain the pollen. And then many of you may recognize this plant over here. This is a male Garrya silk tassel. And typically plants that are wind pollinated, not always, but many times, they have their flowers arranged in catkins. And this is an example of that, where the male flowers are in these, and by the way, each catkin here contains dozens of male flowers. Each one of those little lobes right there is a male flower. And they're producing pollen. And by hanging down and being susceptible to being shaken by the wind, that facilitates the pollen dispersal in that case. Again, Garrya is dioecious. So the male, there's a male silk tassel plant, and there's a different kind of plant or different individuals that will be female. Alders, on the other hand, and my wife knows all about red alder. Alders are monoecious, which means that both the male and the female flowers are in the same one. But again, the male flowers are in catkins, in long chains like this. All right, well, let's talk about biotic pollination. So this is where there are animals involved. And so there's some sort of a reward. Well, we already know that that's a nectar. So the nectar is produced by the plant, by the male, typically where sorry, lost my train of thought. The nectar is produced in the flower. Usually in the male flower if it's monoecious, although typically the biotically pollinated flowers are bisexual, which means they have both male and female parts in the same plant. Okay, so there's some really interesting syndromes out there that help to facilitate this. And this is a classic example of nature just being amazing in its utility and its effectiveness, and all thanks to evolution. So, for example, in this top illustration, this is, I think, it's a pea plant of some sort, maybe gorse or something related to that. The bee comes in, and by the way, those orange things on the leg are pollen sacs. Honeybees are one of the few, honeybees and bumblebees are some of the few animals that literally feed on pollen and also feed their offspring on pollen. Most pollinators don't bother with that. They just go for the nectar, which is essentially sugar. But here's a bee going for the nectar at the base of this blossom. And while the bee is doing that, the blossom, the keel, what we call the keel down here at the bottom, opens up. The anthers come up and wrap themselves around the back end of the bee, and release the pollen from the anthers as the bee is feeding there. And then the bee has to struggle to get away from this sort of seemingly trap, although it's not very strong as a trap, and the pollen is released. And then here's another one. This is a kind of orchid down here. Again, the bee comes in, goes for the nectar, which is on this white part right here. While the bee is feeding on the nectar, that white part basically slaps down, and that contains the pollen on that. And as it slaps down, it covers the bee with pollen, which then will be also released if there's pollen from another plant on there, that will be released onto the stigma of the female part of the plant. That, by the way, up here, there's this stigma is this, I mean, sorry, the pistil is this sort of heavier piece, and then the anthers and stamens are the lighter piece there. And then here's a plant that many of you are familiar with. This is a lupin, and this is not quite as dramatic, but there is a pretty interesting a method here to make sure that there is pollination in an effective way. And that is that the banner, which is the upper petal, it's a two-part petal that comes up at the back of the flower in the top. Notice that it's a different color up here than it is down here. And so what happens with a lot of plants is that they have basically a signal to a potential pollinator that says, if it's purple, I've already been visited. Go to another one of my flowers, maybe the one up here that has a white banner. And so the bees have basically learned that there's going to be more nectar reward in the flowers that have the white banner as opposed to the flowers that have the purple banner. You'll still see bees visiting both, but they're much more likely to visit the white one, and therefore be much more efficient in the process of pollination. All right, so let's talk about the different categories of pollinators. So insects are huge in terms of pollination. So there are lots and lots of insects, not just bees and butterflies, but lots of other things that are involved in pollinating flowers. So I've got a couple of examples here. So here is a bumblebee on a some sort of a composite, maybe a dahlia or something. And now the bumblebees and honeybees and other nectivorous bees actually can see wavelengths of light that we cannot. And they actually also, there's wavelengths we can see that they cannot, but classically, they can see into the ultraviolet. And a lot of flowers have actually evolved coloration in the ultraviolet wavelengths that is different and typically more bright and more showy than it is in the in our visible wave, in the wavelengths that we call visible light, which is anthropocentric. Basically, we can see it, but not others can. So, for example, here is an evening primrose. There's that cross-shaped stigma. Classic yellow evening primrose like we would have around here, the beach evening primrose or the hooker's evening primrose. And here's what it looks like under ultraviolet light. Totally different look to it. But the bees can see that from far away. They kind of get the idea that that's going to be a source of nectar for them, and so they head over to those flowers that they can see very well. Now, night-flying insects are also highly involved, and they typically go for white flowers or pale flowers of some sort that have very strong scents to them, and are often night bloomers. So down in the desert, we see this quite often. We see some night blooming flowers that are so strong that they smell so strong that you can be walking through the desert at night, you would know where they are, even though if you can't see them. But they're white too, so then once you know, if you have good night vision, or if your eyes are dilated properly, then you can even see them. And same thing with the night flying insects, such as this sphinx moth right here, going for this white flower as well. Some of you are familiar with a couple of the Linanthus species. Let's see, Jonesii and Linanthus dichotomous, which are both night bloomers. And then there's some Enotheras, some of the evening primroses that are also night bloomers that attract these sphinx moths. Sphinx moths are often referred to as hummingbird moths because they can hover. And they have this amazing proboscis that is oftentimes twice the length of their own body. So you can see this, there's the moth. This is a uncoiled proboscis going down into the nectary, which is at the base of this tube right here. So this is a way for hummingbird moths to basically have a monopoly on these kinds of flowers. And so they're very specific. They need to have a very deep tube. If they do have the deep tube, then only the hummingbird moths can get into that where the nectar is. Birds typically go for red, tubular, unscented flowers. And by the way, we see different kinds of birds on different continents. So here in the Americas, we have hummingbirds, and you all know about that. And this is an Anna's hummingbird right here, our resident. There's a female Anna's hummingbird, our resident hummingbird that we see all year round. Here in California, this is not a native species. This is I forget what that is, but anyway, it's not a native species. But there's a California fuchsia and some other red blooming flowers that they go for. They tend to be tubular in the sense that, again, the hummingbird's going to have more of a monopoly on those. Those tubes tend to hang down, so you know, bees and butterflies and so on that cannot hover are unable to do that. Most of them are not able to do that. They need platforms to land on and so on. And by the way, in Eurasia and Africa and what they call the old world, there's a kind of birds called sunbirds. They can hover like hummingbirds, but they also go for these red colored tubular flowers. And since birds, by the way, are not most birds, there are some exceptions to this, but most birds are not olfactory. Some of the vultures and some of the seabirds are exceptions to that, but hummingbirds, for example, and sunbirds are not olfactory in nature. They cannot smell, so having a visual cue like a red flower helps them out. And since again the flowers don't have scents, fragrances associated with them, then that works out just fine. And then finally, there's some mammals that are involved with nectivory, with feeding on nectar. There are some bat species that are obligate nectar feeders. So that, in other words, that's what they eat, period. So for example, this is I think it's a long-nosed bat, I think it's called, found in the deserts in North America and Mexico. And it feeds almost exclusively on the nectar found in some of the big cacti like saguaros and organ pipes and things like that. And those are heavily scented. So again, they're night bloomers. So they also come out at night. They have these strong scents that the bats can detect from long distances. They tend to be big flowers and white colored or pale colored. And so the bats are well adapted and the flowers are well adapted for each other. This, by the way, I forgot to mention, when you have uh, um, animals that have evolved specifically to sort of monopolize plants, like having a long proboscis or a long beak, being able to detect them in different ways, uh, color, scent, and so on. That's referred to as coevolution. So you have basically a give and take where the two organisms are evolving together, and it makes it more efficient and works out really well for them. Down in Australia and New Zealand, they have the marsupials called possums, little critters, and they are very important for pollen dispersal with some of the members of Proteaceae, as we see here. These are Banksia, I think, and some of the other endemic plant species that are down there. And then there's these plants that kind of pull one over on the animals. So there's some flowers that actually trick the pollinators into coming to the flowers, but they are not providing any kind of reward for them. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is the Indonesian corpse flower or cadaver flower. And then this is a small, so this one can actually get to be about 12 feet tall. This is the largest inflorescence in the world. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then this is a stapelia, which is about the size of a 50-cent piece. Do you all know what a 50-cent piece is? I don't know if that still exists. But anyway, you get the idea. So a small flower and a large flower, but they both smell like rotting meat or like feces. And so flies will come in and thinking that they're going to lay their eggs on this nice piece of rotting animal, and it's not. So let's look at this corpse flower here for a minute. By the way, both of these are from the greenhouse at San Francisco State. Um, and see this beach ball down here, this inflatable ball. My wife and I got that in Java, in Bogor, Java, at the Botanic Garden there. They didn't have the flower in bloom at the time, but they were selling these souvenirs. Anyway, this one didn't get very tall. It only got to about 4 or 5 feet tall. And this is in the Araceae, which the Diandra and calla lily and that group of plants. The this sort of leafy thing here that looks like rotting meat on the inside is actually a modified leaf. And then this spike right here contains both male and female flowers. And they're very tiny, they're very small. There's about 1,000 of each actually on this spike, most of them down below the level of this modified leaf. Pretty cool plant. And they also, they only bloom every many years. We haven't had one bloom at the field at the greenhouse for 20 years or something crazy like that, although we still have them. They're just not blooming. They make leaves every year to stay alive, and they have a big tuber underneath there in the pot. Um, and but they're really cool. Hopefully we'll get one to flower here soon. The greenhouse manager is amazing at being able to do that. Perhaps even more amazing are the orchids species that mimic wasps and bees, and probably some other insects as well. So here's a wasp. This is an orchid. To the wasp, that orchid appeared to be a female of its species. This is a male wasp, looked like a female. And in fact, these orchids emit pheromones. And it looks like I misspelled that. Sorry about that. They release pheromones that mimic the female of the species. And so they come in. Sometimes you'll see dozens of them come into the same flowers. with the expectation of mating with that female wasp that is actually not a wasp at all. And then he'll get pollen on him and will go to another flower, hopefully, another orchid, and get fooled again. You know what they say about getting fooled again. And will pollinate the orchids through trickery. All right. Once the pollen has fertilized the egg, I want to talk about the production of seeds. You know, I taught a class called World of Plants for many years. I had between about 120 and 150 students every semester. Big class, GE course. And one of the things that students constantly got confused about is that pollen dispersal and seed dispersal are two different things. So I just want to emphasize that. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. I've been talking about pollen dispersal so far. Let's talk about seed dispersal. But first, we have to talk about the production of the seed. So we talked about the fertilization results in the zygote. The zygote then undergoes mitosis, produces many, many more cells to produce the embryo. So here is a developing embryo inside of the ovule. By the way, a good way to think about ovules is pea plant or pea pod, right? So the pea pod is the fruit. And when you open it up, you see there's, you know, a handful of peas in there. Each one of those is essentially an ovule that will eventually become a seed. And we typically, you know, sweet peas, we typically eat those before they become the seed part, but that's a good visual for you. A lot of plants only have a single ovule in each flower. So think of like an avocado or a peach or something like that. Those have a single ovule inside of the plant. By the way, the upper view shows a dicot plant, and the lower view shows a monocot. Sorry, it's up and down here. So sorry about that. I beg your pardon. I got confused again. The upper part has to do with the development in an ovule. The lower part just shows the difference between a dicot on the left and a monocot on the right. There we go. I had mentioned earlier that the endosperm, which is the triploid material, can serve as a source of food for the developing embryo. Developing embryo in this case is green. The endosperm is yellowish color. And then there's also a third component. So we got the embryo, we've got the food source, and there's also the seed coat. And the seed coat comes from these layers of tissue that were produced by the mother plant and become the seed protection for the developing embryo inside of there. All right. Okay. All right, so let's talk about fruits. Turns out that all angiosperms have fruits. Gymnosperms do not have fruits. Remember that's what the term gymnosperm means, naked seed. But angiosperms, again, vessel seed, can have fruits. And technically that's a mature ovary, an ovary being a part of a pistil in a flowering plant. Now they can be fleshy or dry. So you all are familiar with fleshy fruits. So think of you know, blueberries or grapes or bananas or watermelons and so on. And it turns out that even things like pumpkins and squashes, tomatoes and so on, those are all fleshy fruits. Or they can be dry. Now, dry fruits are typically not the kinds of fruits that we eat unless it's a grain or a legume or something like that. Then we eat dry fruits. But they can be dehiscent or indehiscent. Dehiscent means that the fruit at maturity opens up and releases the seeds out of the fruit, and then the seeds are the propagule. And I've included a illustration of poppy plants here. So poppies are a really good example of a dehiscent dry fruit. So they basically they open up at the top. They're like little salt and pepper shakers, and when the wind blows, the seeds come out. Another good example of a dry dehiscent fruit are legumes. So if you're familiar with lupins or gorse, or if you let your pea plants go too long, the two halves of the pea pod open up, release the seed, while the rest of the pod stays on the plant. Indehiscent basically means that the fruit does not release the seed, and that it's the whole fruit that leaves the plant as a propagule. So acorns, for example, are a really good are an example of indehiscent fruits. So some other examples would be chestnuts and hazelnuts, that group. And I'm blanking on anything. Some of the samaras with the winged seeds, winged fruits, basically. So maples and ashes and things like that. Those are indehiscent dry fruits. So the way that a fruit develops is essentially the ovary swells up to become a protective covering around the developing seed or seeds, depending upon what we're talking about. So here, for example, is a flower. There's the ovule with the zygote, that's a little orange thing there, and the endosperm, which is going to be the food source for the zygote, developing into the embryo, which is this piece here, all inside of a seed. And then the fruit is the outside part. It turns out that with peaches that it's a little bit crazy. So I'm not going to go into this too much detail, but a fruit is made up of 3 layers: the endocarp, the mesocarp, and the exocarp. Endo meaning inside, meso meaning middle, and exo meaning outside. So in a peach, for example, the outside layer, that real thin, sort of fuzzy layer, that's the exocarp. The part that that is juicy and sweet and you love to eat it is the mesocarp, and it's very thick in the case of a peach. And then the endocarp is actually hard. That's hard and inedible. That's the pit. And inside the pit, when you shake a peach seed that's been sitting around for a while and you can hear that something's in there, that's the seed inside. You don't see the seed. Some fruits, it turns out that the fleshy part is actually not ovarian tissue, that it's actually a receptacle. So strawberries and apples are examples of that. So the fruit of a strawberry are these little things that get stuck in your teeth. That's the extent of a fruit of a strawberry, is that little tiny thing, and that contains a seed in there. There's not much to it. There's very little thin exocarp to the fruit. Actually, the whole thing: exocarp, mesocarp, endocarp, and then the seeds inside of that. With the apple, the core is actually the fruit, is the ripened ovary, and then the fleshy part that you eat, that's all receptacle tissue. By the way, receptacle is essentially the part, you can see my cursor here, it's the part of the flower that it's actually not part of the flower, it's part of the stem of the flower upon which the flower sits. And anyway, it's all physiological, and they watched how these developed, and they can tell in that regard. All right, let's talk about seed dispersal then. So again, like with pollen dispersal, there are 2 ways that seeds can be dispersed. It can be either abiotic or it can be biotic. Abiotic seed dispersal, unlike pollen dispersal, is not restricted to wind, although there are lots of seeds and fruits that are dispersed by wind. So here's a dandelion. These little black things that are attached there, that's the fruit of the plant. These are indehiscent, which means the entire fruit is acts as the propagule for the plant. And they have this little extra bit on there that acts like a parachute in the wind and works very well. Again, samaras like maples and ashes, they have the little wing on them. Those are also dispersed in the air, and by having the wings on the fruit, they can go a lot farther than they otherwise could. So that's wind dispersal. There is also aquatic dispersal, in this case, marine dispersal. Here is a coconut, and that's lost its outer exocarp. What we see here is just the endocarp. The mesocarp is the sort of fibrous inside part, inside the husk of a coconut. And then if you went down to Safeway and you bought a coconut, that is the endocarp, and then the seeds would be inside. You don't see those very often. You have to actually let the coconut ripen in order to do that. But if they float, so these coconut fruits float, and they wash up on the beach, and then here's one sprouting. So those are dispersed by water. And then I've included here, this is Ecbolium. It's in the cucumber family, Cucurbitaceae. There's the fruit right there, a little spiny thing. These are exploding fruits. And these are really fun because they're juicy exploders. If you touch a ripened Ecbolium fruit, it pops open, releases this seed in a juicy matrix, bunch of seeds in a juicy matrix. Many of you are familiar, if you weed in your yards, a pop rocket, which is a little Arabis or something like a Brassicaceae. And then there's an oxalis, a little yellow flowered oxalis that also has exploding fruits. So those are abiotically dispersed seeds or fruits. And then biotically dispersed seeds are where animals are involved. One of the coolest are the juicy fruits that are brightly colored. They have a fleshy matrix, usually a mesocarp, and they have a seed that is very protected, very well protected, and can survive going through the gut of a bird or a mammal. And so there are actually a lot of birds and mammals that have evolved to be frugivores. Frugivore meaning a fruit-eating animal. So here we have cedar waxwing, pretty common here in California. They almost exclusively eat fruits during the year. During breeding season, they will go over to insects, but for the most part, they eat fruits. Here's a hornbill, tropical. These are tropical animals, tropical birds. Here in the New World, we have toucans. Those are both frugivore animals for the most part. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, they eat fruits. Here's one sort of juggling a little fruit in its beak. And then there's some mammals like this spider monkey down here that also are involved with eating fruits, almost exclusively in a lot of cases. And then some seeds are hitchhikers. So fruits are seeds. So for example, this poor dog, it looks like it feels guilty about getting into the cocklebur patch. We don't have cockleburs here in California too much, at least that I've seen. But out east, they can be a real problem, especially if you have pets. Speaking of pets, they can get these grass seeds from foxtail and brome and other grasses that have little barbs on them that get into your socks or get into your pet's hair. And then some of you may recognize this. This is the gallium or bedstraw, which has these little barbs all over the stems and the leaves, but also on the fruits. And those hitchhike on fur or feathers using little hooks. and they basically get spread based on that, on those characteristics. And then finally, a third type of biotic seed dispersal is caching, where there's rodents that, oh, sorry, it's the wrong picture. There we go. Okay. So rodents are caching seeds, squirrels and mice and other kinds of animals. Even birds will do this to some extent. Will stash their loot somewhere so that later on they can go back and they can get their acorns or their pine nuts or whatever they are stashing for later. And a lot of times what will happen is they will die. Rodents don't live very long. They don't live very many years, and they may have died before bequeathing their cache to their offspring. Or they may just even plain forget where they stuck their pile of acorns. And by doing that, then those will reproduce, they'll germinate and produce embryos and so on. Typically, we see with these kinds of plants that sort of depend upon that. And in fact, there are a lot that do. Oaks are a really good example of this. They produce the mast, what's called a mast. And mast is essentially where they produce all of their seeds, the fruits actually, the acorn is a fruit, seeds inside. They produce all of their propagules at the same time. Each tree is just going to be covered and filled with thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of acorns, and they'll all ripen at the same time. And so if the squirrels and the acorn woodpeckers and the humans don't go and collect those fruits right at that time during the mast, then they're going to lose out. Otherwise, they can cache them and have them later on. But they've actually these plants have literally evolved to do it that way, to propagate in that manner. Et voila, seedlings. So I'd like to finish up by thanking some of my botanical mentors, Dr. Patterson, Dr. Cantley, Dr. Carnell, and I forgot a couple I noticed here, Tom Parker and Mike Vasey, Phil Van Solen, Martin Grantham, Elliot Levin. Those three people are amazing horticulturalists that I am honored to be familiar with. And then the staff and volunteers at Alamany Farm, and lots of inspired plant lovers over the years. So my wish for you is that you all remain seedlings. And with that, I will take questions. I'm not sure how to do this, Mila.
Well, thank you, Jared. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Walk through the world of pollination. My goodness.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
From soup to nuts, as we say.
Yes, indeed. By the way, with regards to these caches that rodents and others produce.
This one?
Well, yes, precisely. Is there a particular distance within which they are parameters within which they stay? I mean, how far do they go in order to create their caches?
Yeah, I think it really depends upon the animal. So the squirrels are going to be going farther out than the mice, for example. Dr. Parker, in his lab, he actually had some graduate students that were working on that. They set up little cameras, and they underneath manzanita, they were looking at caching manzanita berries, which contain juicy seeds, and they were watching mice do that. And I don't think the mice go very far. They pretty much stick right around in their territory, essentially. Whereas if you look at a bird like an acorn woodpecker, they can go quite a ways from their home base to create these caches.
And as you said, they tend to forget or leave a good number of the seeds
Yeah.
behind. And so I know from our acorn tree, we have acorns galore
Right.
sprouting, and it's like we call it the oak orchard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they sprout in pots and ground anywhere and
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
Yeah, the jays and everyone have been quite busy, and the squirrels.
Yeah.
So, okay. So as such, seems
That's it. No questions?
no questions?
Yes, I was thorough.
Yes, very thorough. You were mentioning too that the nectar is created by the male part of,
Well, it depends upon the plant. So if it is um so it's if it's let me think about that for a minute. Yeah, so typically if it's found at the base of the bisexual flower, which has both male and female. Yeah.
it's at the
But
base, at the receptacle area.
yeah, yeah, right, right.
Uh-huh.
So for example, let's see. So you can see where this bee has got its proboscis stuck in there. That's typical of where it would be located. And then this has both stamens, which are the thin lines, and a pistil, which
But
is
the
the thicker one.
stamens and the pistils, they don't have nectar. So the
No,
nectar is way deep and created, it's actually created by the flower, but by which part exactly did you say?
well, it depends, but pretty much it's a separate structure. And
Uh,
again, let me show you something else. So for example, with a tubular flower like that one, or these right here, the nectary is a gland. It's essentially a gland that's right at the base of the flower.
so
But yeah,
So the plants put an enormous amount of energy
yeah,
into creating this nectar so that that in order that the flower doesn't get pollinated.
yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
I mean I know that there are insects that cheat. You know,
Yes,
they drill in from the
yeah,
side.
yep. I forgot about to put that in here. I'll put that in here for the next time. But there are nectar thieves
Yeah.
that literally will drill a hole right where the nectary is without doing any kind of pollinating. And so, um, yeah, so that definitely happens. And there's some bird groups of the flower piercers that have evolved. The whole family has evolved to be nectar thieves. But yeah, I forgot to mention that.
And how is it that you can have fleshy fruits like watermelon and so on, and lemons and so on and so forth, and you don't even have a seed in there? I mean, it used to be that you had a
Yeah,
watermelon and all you were doing was spitting out seeds. And
yeah,
now you can
that
buy a huge watermelon and there's not
yeah.
one seed to be
Humans have
found.
really messed things up. I got to tell you,
Who?
humans.
Ah, it's all genetically monitored.
That's right. So it's basically selective breeding, uh, which is genetic modification. It's genetic modification has been going on for 10,000 years or so.
Right.
Call it selective breeding. Genetic manipulation or genetic engineering, that's a new thing, right? But yeah, that's humans have kind of messed things up.
I keep looking for seeds and I'm going, Adrian, there's a watermelon here with not one seed in it.
Yeah.
So,
So I see Perry has asked me a question here.
yes, Perry, where in plant phylogeny do the different pollination strategies occur? Aha.
I can see it. So um, okay, that's a complicated question. And it's not something that I probably can answer if at all, certainly not in a short amount of time. So it really depends. So we see groups of organisms, groups of plants, for example, that have evolved characteristics that facilitate pollination. And then that characteristic is selected for throughout the lineage. And then we see other situations where a characteristic evolves in a small part of a lineage, or it evolves and then is not carried on necessarily in other lineages. It's hard to say how that happens, whether which came first, the characteristic that was then lost in a certain lineage, or was the did the characteristic evolve after the diversification of the two lineages. So but some of these pollination syndromes, like the bee mimic, for example, or those plants that evolved signals that say I've been pollinated. Those seem to be fairly recent evolutionary events, as far as I know. And again, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm more of a taxonomist than a systematist. So,
And Deborah.
Deborah asked about extrafloral nectaries. Those are so cool. So extrafloral nectaries are, if you think about that word, these are where these glands, these nectar producing glands, are not in the flower. They're elsewhere. And so those typically have some other function. And again, I'm not really familiar with them. I know them sort of peripherally. I know about these. I know a lot of them are involved with ants and keeping ants around the plant. So ants serve as a really great herbivore deterrent. So if there's a leaf-eating primate, or a bird that is going to eat leaves or whatever, or an insect, right, that eats leaves, a caterpillar or whatever, ants are going to keep those away from them if the ant is on that tree or that shrub. And so to answer your question, yes, they definitely have a different purpose than pollination. That said, that's all I know about it, Deborah. I don't know if there are other functions for extrafloral nectaries than keeping ants around.
Oh, keeping ants around. And
Yeah.
that protects the plants,
Protects
obviously.
the plants, and not only that, but there are some plants that have, in addition to extrafloral nectaries, they also have these structures that are called domatia, domatia. Domatia are essentially where the plants have provided a home for the ants. So there are plants that have both extrafloral nectaries and domatia. And then there's other plants that have one or the other, but not both. Uh, so yeah, that's pretty advanced evolutionary event, essentially, to have evolved the ability to keep ants around by providing them food through the extrafloral nectary and providing a home through the domatia.
And this is nothing at all like gulls that just sort of invade a particular plant in order to procreate their own species.
You're talking about insect galls?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing too, and I think there's a lot of, again, I'm not an expert on galls, but there are a lot of different insect and even non-insect arthropod lineages that form galls. So not just wasps and true bugs, but also mites and some other things that form that essentially lay their eggs inside of the tissues, and then the tissues respond by creating a home. That's different than a domatium.
Yeah.
Domatium is there from the beginning and is almost exclusively ants. I've never heard of any other kind of insect or non-insect utilizing domatia or extrafloral nectaries that I know of, but there might be. I'm not real sure. I don't think so.
Sure, and this whole thing about UV landing strips, basically, as some people refer to them, on petals that are not visible to us as human beings, but are
Right.
visible to various
Yeah,
bees,
bees mostly.
bees mostly, and it's like a landing pad for them, and they see these UV lines
Yeah.
that are created. So do you happen to know if this has been around for a long time and has evolved quite a
Yeah,
while back also?
I don't know how long it's been around, but it's very pervasive and it's in a lot of different plants. So
Uh-huh.
here's the evening primrose. They're also in composites, Asteraceae.
Uh-huh.
Iridaceae is very famous for having irises.
Yeah.
Are famous for having these basically that's what I envision like an airport having these lights that are going
Mhm.
in this way pulling them in, but you can
Straight to the point here. This is where you have to go.
yeah. So it's evolved many times in many different lineages, which was really interesting. So it just gives you an idea of how well evolution works.
And this coevolution is just
Yeah,
fascinating. It's like who lay it, what comes first, the hen, the chick, or what is it they say?
chicken or the egg.
The chicken or the egg, and you see this,
Yeah,
how they have literally made accommodations for one another,
yeah,
and it's just the most incredible thing when you come to think of it.
it really is. Yeah, very
Truly
cool stuff.
fascinating. But you've been with us, and I must thank you again. You've been with us for a good little while. The lecture was fascinating,
Thank you.
and you've answered my questions, which I've always have, and given some folks a chance to put in their questions. And so, thank you so much, and I'll be in touch shortly.
Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, take care, and we'll be
Weekends.
ending our Zoom lecture today with JR. So thank you for being with us, and we'll see you at the end of March.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
Take care. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao.
I'll
Good night, everyone.
see you next time.
Righto.